The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of courtroom 302 at the Jefferson County Courthouse. Sarah Martinez shifted in the hard wooden bench, her fingers lightly tapping the manila envelope that held her evidence. The clock on the wall read 9:15 a.m., and she was number 14 on the day's traffic court docket. At 42 years old, Sarah had spent the last 15 years building her reputation as a documentary filmmaker. Her dark curly hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple but professional navy blue blazer over a white blouse. She had debated wearing something more casual, but decided that appearing in court demanded respect, even if it was just for a parking ticket. The courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation as people waited for their cases to be called. A young mother tried to quiet her restless toddler 2 rows ahead. An elderly man in a worn baseball cap kept checking his watch. The air conditioning hummed overhead, barely cutting through the stuffy morning air. Judge William Blackwood entered precisely at 9:30 a.m., his black robe swishing as he climbed the 3 steps to his bench. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Everyone stood, and Sarah noticed how the judge didn't even glance at the gathered crowd as he took his seat. "Be seated," Judge Blackwood said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years on the bench. He was in his early 60s, with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that he constantly pushed up his nose. The first few cases moved quickly, mostly speeding tickets and stop sign violations. Sarah watched carefully as the judge handled each case. She noticed a pattern. When well-dressed businessmen approached the bench, Judge Blackwood seemed more inclined to reduce their fines. When younger people or those in casual clothing stepped forward, his tone grew sharper, his decisions quicker and less forgiving. Sarah's heart beat faster as she watched a young black man try to explain that his tail light had been fixed the very next day after his ticket. The judge cut him off mid-sentence and ordered him to pay the full fine. The young man's shoulders slumped as he walked away from the bench. As she waited, Sarah reviewed her evidence one more time. The parking ticket had been issued 3 weeks ago outside the downtown library. She had documentation from the library staff confirming that the meter had been reported faulty that same morning. There were even photos from other library patrons showing the error message on the meter's display. Her phone vibrated silently in her pocket, probably another message from her producer about the upcoming Emmy Awards ceremony. Their documentary, Justice in the Shadows, had been nominated, and they were finalizing their acceptance speech, just in case. But Sarah pushed those thoughts aside. Right now, she was just another citizen in traffic court. The bailiff called out, "Number 14, Sarah Martinez, parking violation on West Main Street." Sarah gathered her documents and stood up, smoothing her blazer. As she walked toward the bench, she felt the weight of several eyes following her. She had learned long ago that being a black woman meant people watched you differently, especially in places like this. Judge Blackwood was writing something in his notes when she reached the podium. He didn't look up immediately, and Sarah stood quietly, her hands resting on her folder. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a door squeaked open and closed. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Blackwood finally said, glancing up briefly, "you're charged with parking at an expired meter on April 3rd. How do you plead?" His tone suggested this was just another routine case, another face in the endless parade of traffic violations he dealt with daily. Sarah took a deep breath, ready to present her evidence. She had no way of knowing that the next few minutes would spark a chain of events that would challenge not just a simple parking ticket, but the very nature of justice and recognition in their small corner of the world. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah said clearly, opening her folder. "I have evidence showing that the parking meter was malfunctioning that day." She started to pull out the library staff's written statement, but Judge Blackwood held up his hand. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice carrying a hint of impatience, "do you know how many people come into my courtroom claiming parking meters don't work?" He looked down at her over his glasses, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk. The morning sun had shifted, casting half his face in shadow. Sarah remained calm, though she felt her heart beating faster. "I understand, Your Honor, but I have official documentation from the library staff." She tried again to show him the papers, but the judge's expression hardened. "The officer who issued this ticket," Judge Blackwood continued as if she hadn't spoken, "has served this community for 15 years. Are you suggesting he made a mistake?" His tone made it clear what answer he expected. The courtroom had grown quieter. Sarah could feel the other people watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The young mother from earlier held her child closer, while the elderly man with the baseball cap shook his head slightly. "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied carefully, choosing her words. "I'm not suggesting any mistake by the officer. I'm simply presenting evidence about the meter's condition." She pulled out the first document, along with clear photographs showing the meter's error message. Judge Blackwood barely glanced at them. "Ms. Martinez, I see parking violations like this every day. The fine is $150. He started writing in his ledger, clearly considering the matter closed. Sarah took a deep breath. She thought about all the times she had documented similar scenes for her films. Moments when voices went unheard, when evidence went unseen. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe I have the right to present my evidence." The judge's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. The bailiff took a small step forward, and Sarah noticed his hand move closer to his belt. The tension in the room grew thicker. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "are you telling me how to run my courtroom?" He removed his glasses, cleaning them slowly with a white handkerchief he pulled from his robe pocket. Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed again in her pocket. She had forgotten to turn it off completely. Judge Blackwood's face darkened. "Phones should be silenced in my courtroom, Ms. Martinez. That will be an additional $50 fine." Sarah's producer had been trying to reach her all morning about the Emmy nomination. The ceremony was just 2 weeks away, and they needed to finalize their presentation. But right now, none of that mattered. She was just another person in traffic court, watching justice bend away from truth. "I apologize for the phone, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice steady. "But regarding the parking violation, I have 3 separate documents confirming the meter malfunction, including statements from library employees who reported the problem that morning." Judge Blackwood put his glasses back on and leaned forward. "Ms. Martinez, your continued arguing is trying my patience. The fine now stands at $200, and if you persist, I will find you in contempt of court." The bailiff took another small step forward. Sarah could hear whispers behind her, could feel the weight of eyes on her back. She thought about the young man earlier, about how quickly his case had been dismissed. She thought about all the others who had stood where she stood, evidence in hand, voices unheard. Her phone buzzed one final time in her pocket, and this time, the bailiff heard it too. He moved closer to the judge's bench, leaning in to whisper something. Sarah watched as Judge Blackwood's expression shifted, just slightly, as he listened to whatever the bailiff was saying. The morning sun had fully reached the judge's bench now, illuminating dust particles in the air between them, like tiny stars waiting for the next scene to unfold. The bailiff's whispered words seemed to hang in the air. Judge Blackwood's expression flickered between annoyance and curiosity as he listened. He glanced down at his computer screen, where the bailiff was pointing at something. The courtroom remained silent, waiting. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Blackwood said finally, his tone shifting slightly. "It seems you work in television?" He adjusted his glasses, squinting at his screen. "I'm a documentary filmmaker, Your Honor," Sarah replied simply. She didn't mention the Emmy nomination or her previous awards. She had learned long ago that sometimes the quietest voice carried the most weight. The judge's face tightened. "Well, Ms. Martinez, your profession doesn't grant you special privileges in this courtroom." He shuffled some papers on his desk, not meeting her eyes. "The fine stands at $200, and I'm adding another $50 for disrupting court proceedings." Sarah felt her hands grip the folder tighter, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for special privileges. I'm only asking that you review the evidence I brought." She took out the photographs again, along with the written statements. A young clerk hurried up to the judge's bench, carrying a tablet. She whispered something to the bailiff, who then passed the message to Judge Blackwood. The judge's face changed color slightly as he looked at whatever was on the tablet's screen. The elderly man with the baseball cap had stopped checking his watch. The young mother had stopped trying to quiet her child. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, seizing the moment of uncertainty, "I have a statement from Maria Gonzalez, the head librarian, confirming that the meter in question was reported broken at 8:15 that morning." She held up the official library letterhead. I also have photos from 3 different library patrons showing the error message on the meter's display. Judge Blackwood was no longer looking at her or the evidence. His eyes were fixed on the tablet screen, where the clerk was scrolling through something. The bailiff leaned in again, pointing at specific items on the screen. Sarah's phone buzzed once more in her pocket. This time, Judge Blackwood didn't comment on it. Instead, he cleared his throat and asked, "This documentary work of yours, what subjects do you cover?" "Various topics, Your Honor," Sarah answered carefully. "My most recent work focuses on the American justice system." She paused, letting that information settle in the courtroom air. The young clerk's eyes widened slightly. She whispered something else to the bailiff, who nodded knowingly. Judge Blackwood's face had grown increasingly pale. "And this recent work," the judge continued, his voice noticeably different now, "it wouldn't happen to be justice in the shadows, would it?" He finally looked directly at Sarah, really seeing her for perhaps the first time that morning. Before Sarah could answer, the courthouse door opened. A tall woman in a business suit walked quickly to the clerk's desk, handing over some papers. Sarah recognized her as the courthouse administrator she had interviewed 6 months ago for her documentary. The administrator looked up, noticed Sarah, and smiled in recognition. "Ms. Martinez, I just finished the diversity training program based on your documentary. It's being implemented in courthouses across the state." Her voice carried clearly through the quiet courtroom. Judge Blackwood's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass. He had been scheduled to attend that same training program next week, the same program that would use clips from Sarah's documentary to illustrate bias in the justice system. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier. The morning sun now filled the entire judge's bench with light, leaving nowhere for shadows to hide. Judge Blackwood looked down at the pile of evidence Sarah had been trying to show him all morning, evidence he had dismissed without a single glance. The next words he spoke would change more than just the outcome of a simple parking ticket. Judge Blackwood set down his water glass with a shaking hand. Small droplets had spilled onto his papers, creating tiny dark circles on the documents he had refused to read. The courthouse administrator was still standing near the clerk's desk, her presence a silent reminder of the changes Sarah's documentary had already brought to their justice system. "Ms. Martinez," the judge began, his voice markedly different from his earlier harsh tone, "perhaps we should review your evidence more thoroughly." He reached out his hand, finally willing to look at the papers Sarah had been trying to show him all morning. Sarah stepped forward, laying out her documents one by one. First, the library staff's statement about the broken meter. Then, the clear photographs showing the error message. Finally, the maintenance report confirming that the meter had been repaired later that same day. The young mother in the audience shifted her sleeping child to her other shoulder, watching intently. The elderly man with the baseball cap had stopped fidgeting entirely. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to sense they were witnessing something important. "Your documentary," Judge Blackwood said quietly as he examined the evidence. "It's being considered for an Emmy Award, isn't it?" He didn't look up as he asked this, his eyes fixed on the papers before him. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied simply. She noticed how the bailiff's stance had changed, becoming more respectful. The young clerk was typing rapidly into her computer, probably looking up more information about Sarah's work. The courthouse administrator stepped forward. "Judge Blackwood, Ms. Martinez's documentary has already been adopted by 15 state court systems for their judicial training programs. It's revolutionizing how we address bias in our courts." Her words hum in the air like a gentle accusation. Judge Blackwood's face flushed red. He was scheduled to attend one of those training sessions next week. He would have to sit there, watching clips from Sarah's documentary, while remembering how he had treated her in his own courtroom just days before. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, she reached for it openly. "I apologize, Your Honor, but this might be important. It's about the Emmy ceremony." She looked at him questioningly, and he nodded his permission. The text message read, "Final schedule for Emmy acceptance speech rehearsal, tomorrow at 2 p.m. Whole crew needed." Sarah put her phone away, noting how the judge watched her with a mixture of embarrassment and newfound respect. "Ms. Martinez," Judge Blackwood said, clearing his throat, "I see here that the meter was indeed reported malfunctioning at 8:15 a.m. on the day in question." He held up the library staff statement, the same one he had dismissed earlier. and these photographs clearly show the error message. The courtroom remained silent, but the tension had shifted. Now it was Judge Blackwood who seemed uncomfortable, while Sarah stood calmly, waiting for justice to find its proper course. In light of this evidence, the judge continued, his voice growing stronger as he tried to regain his professional demeanor, I have no choice but to dismiss the parking violation. He paused, then added, and I'll remove the additional fines I imposed earlier. The courthouse administrator smiled slightly and nodded. She had seen this scene play out before, in different ways, in different courtrooms. It was why Sarah's documentary had become so important, why it was changing things one courthouse at a time. Sarah gathered her documents quietly, aware that every eye in the courtroom was on her. She had come here expecting a simple traffic court appearance. Instead, she had become part of the very story she had been documenting, how justice sometimes needed a mirror held up to see itself clearly. The morning sun had shifted again, and now it illuminated the entire courtroom. Judge Blackwood's bench no longer cast any shadows, but this story wasn't over yet. It was about to take another unexpected turn. As Sarah started to turn away from the bench, Judge Blackwood spoke again. Miss Martinez, a moment please. His voice had lost its earlier harshness, replaced by something that sounded almost like humility. The courthouse administrator moved closer to the front of the courtroom. Other cases were waiting to be heard, but everyone seemed to understand that something more important was happening here. The young mother had woken her child, as if she wanted the little one to witness this moment. Your documentary, Judge Blackwood continued, removing his glasses and cleaning them nervously with his handkerchief. The one about judicial bias. I'm scheduled to view it next week during our mandatory training session. He paused, putting his glasses back on. But I believe I've just lived through one of its lessons, haven't I? Sarah stood quietly, letting the judge's words fill the courtroom. Behind her, she could hear whispers from the audience. The elderly man with the baseball cap was nodding slowly, understanding spreading across his weathered face. Your Honor, Sarah replied carefully, my documentary explores how our preconceptions can influence our decisions, even when we don't realize it's happening. She gestured to the evidence folder still open on his bench. Sometimes we think we know the whole story before we've even looked at the first page. The young clerk was still typing, but now she was printing something. She handed a paper to the bailiff, who brought it to Judge Blackwood. It was a synopsis of Sarah's documentary, including quotes from judicial reviews and recommendations from state Supreme Court justices. Judge Blackwood read the paper slowly, his face growing more serious with each line. The courthouse administrator stepped forward again. Judge, Ms. Martinez's work has been particularly effective in helping us recognize unconscious patterns in our daily proceedings. Patterns, the judge repeated quietly, looking at the stack of cases still waiting to be heard. How many other pieces of evidence had he dismissed without proper consideration? How many other voices had he silenced with his impatience? Sarah's phone buzzed once more. This time, it was an email congratulating her on being selected to speak at next month's National Judicial Conference about bias in the court system. The irony of the timing wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Ms. Martinez, Judge Blackwood said, his voice carrying a new weight, I believe I owe you more than just a dismissal of these fines. He straightened in his chair, seeming to make a decision. I would like to formally apologize for my behavior this morning. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the usual sounds of papers shuffling and quiet whispers ceased. In 15 years of practicing law in this courthouse, no one could remember hearing Judge Blackwood apologize for anything. Furthermore, he continued, I would like to request something. He glanced at the courthouse administrator, who nodded encouragingly. Would you be willing to come speak to our judicial panel? Before the training session next week, I think hearing directly from you would be valuable for all of us. The young mother in the audience wiped a tear from her eye. The elderly man with the baseball cap stood up straighter. They all seemed to realize they were watching more than just a traffic court proceeding. They were watching change happen in real time. Sarah considered the judge's request. Through her camera lens, she had documented countless stories of bias and injustice. But here was something different, a chance to create change from within the system itself. The morning sunlight now filled the entire courtroom, warming the old wooden benches and illuminating the faces of everyone present. It felt like a new day was truly beginning, right here in courtroom 302. But no one could have predicted what would happen next, as this simple traffic court appearance was about to spark a movement that would reach far beyond these courthouse walls. Sarah took a deep breath before answering the judge's request. The weight of this moment wasn't lost on her, how a simple parking ticket had opened the door to something much bigger. The courthouse administrator stepped closer, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. "Your Honor," Sarah began, "I would be happy to speak with the judicial panel." She paused, then added, "But I have one condition." The bailiff tensed slightly, but Judge Blackwood nodded for her to continue. "I'd like to bring my film crew," Sarah said. "Not to film you or any specific judge, but to document this moment of change. To show that real transformation is possible when we're willing to acknowledge our mistakes and learn from them." Judge Blackwood gripped the edges of his bench, his knuckles turning white. Being filmed wasn't what he had expected. The young clerk looked up from her computer, her eyes wide. The courthouse administrator, however, was smiling. "I think that's an excellent idea," the administrator said. "Too often, these moments of progress happen behind closed doors. Showing the process of change could be powerful." She turned to Judge Blackwood, waiting for his response. The elderly man in the baseball cap had pulled out his phone and was typing something. The young mother was whispering to another person in the audience. Word was already spreading about what was happening in courtroom 302. Judge Blackwood took off his glasses again, but this time he didn't clean them. He just held them in his hands, looking more human and less imposing without them. "You want to film me admitting I was wrong?" he asked quietly. "No, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "I want to film you showing other judges that growth is possible, that we can all learn and do better." She gestured to the waiting courtroom. "Every case that comes before you is an opportunity to show equal justice under law." The judge put his glasses back on slowly. The morning sun caught the lenses, briefly reflecting light across the courtroom. "Ms. Martinez, do you know why I became a judge?" he asked, surprising everyone with the personal question. Sarah shook her head, and the judge continued. "I wanted to make sure everyone got a fair hearing. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that. I started seeing case numbers instead of people." He looked at the stack of remaining cases on his desk. Today was a wake-up call. The courthouse administrator stepped forward. "Judge, we could make this part of our larger judicial reform initiative. Ms. Martinez's documentary already laid the groundwork. This could be the next chapter." Sarah's phone buzzed again, another message about the Emmy ceremony. But now it seemed small compared to what was happening here. Real change was possible, not just on screen, but in this very courtroom. "What time would the film crew need to be here?" Judge Blackwood asked, his voice stronger now. The question itself was an answer. He was agreeing to be filmed, to be part of the change. The young mother in the audience had tears in her eyes again. The elderly man with the baseball cap was nodding with approval. They could feel it too. This wasn't just about one judge or one filmmaker anymore. This was about transforming the system itself. "We could be here tomorrow morning," Sarah said, "before your regular session begins." She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. "My producer will want to talk to you about the details." As she handed the card to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Blackwood, Sarah noticed how differently everyone was looking at her now. But more importantly, she noticed how differently the judge was looking at everyone else in his courtroom. The morning was only half over, but courtroom 302 had already changed. What started as a simple parking ticket was becoming something much more significant, and tomorrow, when the cameras arrived, a new story would begin, one that would reach far beyond these courthouse walls. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse before sunrise. Her film crew was setting up their equipment in courtroom 302, the cameras catching the first rays of dawn through the tall windows. The familiar smell of coffee drifted through the hallways as early morning staff began their day. Judge Blackwood stood in his chambers, adjusting his robe in the mirror. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie. In 30 years on the bench, he had never allowed cameras in his courtroom, but today was different. Today, he was choosing to be part of the change. The courthouse administrator had arrived early too, carrying a stack of papers. "The other judges want to attend," she told Sarah. "Word spread about what happened yesterday. They want to be here for this." She smiled, shuffling through her documents. "And not just from our courthouse. Judges from 3 neighboring counties are driving in." Sarah's producer, Marcus, was checking the lighting. "This is bigger than we expected," he whispered to Sarah. "We might need more cameras." He gestured to the growing crowd of legal professionals filing into the courtroom, many carrying copies of Sarah's documentary on their tablets. The young mother from yesterday had returned, this time with her husband. The elderly man with the baseball cap was there too, sitting in the same spot. They had brought others with them, people who had faced similar experiences in traffic court, people who wanted to witness this moment of change. At exactly 8:00 a.m., the bailiff called out, "All rise." Judge Blackwood entered, looking more human somehow in front of the cameras. He took his seat and gestured for everyone to sit down. The red lights on the cameras blinked steadily, recording every moment. "Yesterday," the judge began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphones, "I made a mistake. Actually, I've probably been making the same mistake for years." He looked around the packed courtroom, meeting eyes with his fellow judges in the audience. "I forgot that justice isn't about efficiency, it's about listening, about seeing each person who stands before us." Sarah stood behind the main camera, watching through the viewfinder as the judge continued. This wasn't just footage for her next documentary anymore. This was something more powerful, a real-time demonstration of how change could happen. "Ms. Martinez's parking ticket taught me something important," Judge Blackwood said. "It showed me that I had fallen into patterns of bias I didn't even recognize." He held up the evidence folder from yesterday. "I dismissed her evidence without looking at it. I added fines without justification. I behaved exactly like the kind of judge I never wanted to be." The courthouse administrator stepped forward with more papers. "Judge Blackwood has already signed the paperwork to implement new procedures in his courtroom," she announced. "Every piece of evidence will be reviewed. Every voice will be heard. And these changes will be recommended for all courtrooms in our district." The young mother wiped tears from her eyes. The elderly man nodded approvingly. The visiting judges were taking notes, whispering among themselves about implementing similar changes in their own courtrooms. Sarah's phone buzzed, another message about the Emmy ceremony, but somehow that award seemed less important now. Here in courtroom 302, real change was happening. The cameras were capturing something more valuable than any golden statue. "I want to thank Ms. Martinez," Judge Blackwood continued, "not just for her documentary, but for showing me firsthand why her work matters." He turned toward Sarah's camera. "Sometimes it takes seeing our own reflection to recognize what we become, and sometimes it takes one small moment, like a disputed parking ticket, to remind us who we're supposed to be." The morning sun now filled the courtroom completely, its light touching everyone equally: judges, filmmakers, citizens, all gathered together to witness this transformation. But even as this chapter was ending, another was about to begin, one that would reach far beyond what anyone in that courtroom could imagine. 3 months later, Sarah stood on the Emmy stage, holding her award for Best Documentary. The bright lights shone down as she adjusted the microphone, looking out at the sea of faces before her. But her mind was back in courtroom 302, thinking about how a simple parking ticket had started something much bigger. "This award isn't just mine," she began, her voice steady and clear. "It belongs to everyone who helped expose the truth about bias in our justice system." She paused, holding up the golden statue. "And it belongs to those who had the courage to change when confronted with that truth." In the audience, Judge William Blackwood sat straight in his tuxedo, invited as Sarah's special guest. Next to him was the courthouse administrator, who had helped implement the changes that were now spreading across the state. They both watched as Sarah continued her speech. "3 months ago, I went to traffic court for a parking ticket," Sarah told the audience. "What happened next wasn't in my documentary. It became something more powerful, a real example of how change begins." The giant screens behind her showed clips from that morning in courtroom 302. The changes had spread quickly after that day. Judge Blackwood's new procedures were adopted by every courtroom in the district. The young mother who had witnessed everything that morning had started a community group to help people understand their rights in court. The elderly man with the baseball cap now volunteered as a court observer, making sure everyone's evidence was properly reviewed. "Today, 27 state court systems have adopted our training program," Sarah continued. "But more importantly, hundreds of judges like William Blackwood have chosen to look at themselves honestly and make real changes." The camera cut to Judge Blackwood, who nodded solemnly. Back in their hometown, the courthouse had been transformed. Every judge now took time to review evidence carefully. The rushed atmosphere of traffic court had been replaced by something more thoughtful. People felt heard, even when the decisions didn't go their way. Judge Blackwood had become a leading voice for judicial reform. He traveled to other courthouses, sharing his story and encouraging his colleagues to examine their own biases. The parking meter incident had become a teaching moment in judicial training sessions across the country. Change isn't just about making documentaries, Sarah said, nearing the end of her speech. It's about what happens after people watch them. It's about the choice to do better, to be better. She touched the Emmy Award gently. This statue is beautiful, but the real reward has been watching justice become more just. In the audience, people were standing up, applauding. Judge Blackwood wiped a tear from his eye. The courthouse administrator squeezed his hand supportively. They knew this was more than just an award ceremony. It was a celebration of real transformation. Later that night, at the after-party, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo from the courthouse back home. A group of judges gathered around a new sign in courtroom 302. The sign read, "Every voice deserves to be heard. Every story deserves to be told." The young mother who had started the community group sent another message. Traffic court violations in their district had dropped by 40%. People felt more confident about presenting their evidence, and judges were taking more time to listen. The system was slowly healing itself. As Sarah looked at these messages, she smiled. The Emmy Award sat on the table beside her, catching the light. But her real achievement wasn't the golden statue. It was the change that had started that morning in traffic court. A change that was still growing, still spreading, still transforming lives one courtroom at a time. The story that began with a parking ticket had become something much more. A reminder that justice works best when it looks at everyone with equal eyes, listens with equal ears, and treats everyone with equal respect. And somewhere in courtroom 302, the morning sun still streamed through those tall windows, illuminating a space where change was not just possible, but happening every single day.